Coming up on the remarkable 20th century.
Out space, we stand apologetic, and we battle for the law.
This was the war to end all wars.
It was very forceful and radical.
Wilson tried to create international order.
The teenagers of the 20th century showed early signs of becoming an agreeable, mildly progressive interlude. Abroad, the funeral of King Edward VII of Britain had brought the leaders of the world together, and the vision of the royals of England, Germany, and Russia sharing condolences and breaking bread together seemed an assurance of peaceful relationships. In America, Woodrow Wilson, the progressive president of Princeton, was elected president of the United States. His vote total, added to that of his progressive opponent, showed the nation's temper pretty unified on progressive goals. Consensus promised temperate politics. The income tax amendment annoyed some. The sinking of the Titanic shocked all. But nothing happened that the spirit of the times couldn't handle. Disaster struck suddenly. The powers of Europe committed themselves to mutual destruction, said the Washington Post at the time, over contentions that a police court could adjust in a week. With marvels like the 600 bullets a minute machine gun now in place, the war would soon justify its name, the Great War. The German Kaiser precipitated it without any clear purpose. Germany had been rising to preeminence from natural causes. If Wilhelm had been asked what he wanted from the war, he could only have answered more, quicker. The war would prove the seminal disaster of the 20th century. It would take the rest of the century up to 1991 and the collapse of the Soviet Union before the ills it caused could be remedied, and the unprecedented loss of life never could be. Now, the aborted era of goodwill, 1910 to 1920.
The world found itself in a period of optimistic transition. The pioneering accomplishments, progress, and technological innovation of the century's first decade pushed the world forward, confident about its future. Since the advent of the Industrial Revolution, European nations were enjoying a steady growth in population, foreign trade, and industrial capability. Politically, pacts and policies held the monarchies of Europe together, ensuring what appeared to be on the surface a lasting peace. In May of 1910, the monarchs of Europe gathered in London, England, to honor the passing of King Edward VII, who died suddenly of pneumonia at the age of 68. The late King Edward had 8 brothers and sisters, and most of them had married into other royal families. Princess Alexandra, King Edward's niece, was married to the ruling Romanov in Russia, Tsar Nicholas II. King Edward's sister, Victoria, had married the German Emperor Frederick III, and her son was the current Kaiser Wilhelm II. It was no wonder that Edward's funeral attracted the most prominent members of the ruling class. From 70 different nations came the most dignified of dignitaries, including former President of the United States, Teddy Roosevelt. Behind the casket of the deceased king followed a royal procession including 9 crowned heads of Europe and Edward's son, the new King of England, George V.
The fact that we see monarchs from the different European countries being friendly with one another at the funeral of Edward VII in 1910 doesn't really tell us that much about what's really going on in the politics of the early 20th century. At this point, monarchs, of course, are more symbolic and figurehead within the politics of a country than they are really players in the politics of the period. And so what's really happening on the ground has nothing to do with the ways in which monarchs will be able to interact with one another at these largely symbolic and formal occasions such as funerals.
A restless undercurrent was subtly spreading across Europe. Rivalries and suspicion between the continental powers simmered as competition for world markets increased. The rivalries led to military expansion, and the formation of two hostile military alliances, the Triple Alliance of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, and the Triple Entente of Great Britain, France, and Russia. Germany, under the leadership of Kaiser Wilhelm II, continually fueled the fire, seeking a more active role in world affairs and continued German expansion.
Germany was a latecomer in industrialization compared to Western neighbors, but became the most developed industrialized country of Europe up to the 1910s. So it was a major gap between the new strengths of Germany and the political status of Germany within Europe or within the world.
Against this backdrop, 1910 America, under the leadership of President William Howard Taft, remained neutral and isolated, absorbed in the enjoyment of all things new. Meanwhile, the United States neighbor, Mexico, was experiencing the beginnings of its own political upheaval. 1910 marked the outbreak of the Mexican Revolution, led by Francisco Madero, who campaigned against the presidency of Porfirio Diaz, who had been in power for 30 years.
The discontent that many social classes and groups in Mexico had over the lack of opportunities, social, economic, politically, that the entrenched government of Porfirio Diaz had had for so long, just made the revolution inevitable.
Diaz had Madero jailed. When he was released a year later, Madero orchestrated an uprising against Diaz and assumed power. In 1910, panic and paranoia of impending doom swept the world when Halley's Comet was observed in its elliptical orbit. Named after the English astronomer Edmund Halley, who first sighted it in 1682, the comet is a phenomenon occurring every 76 years. 1910 was also the year race car driver Barney Oldfield set the land speed record, reaching a then unbelievable 130 miles per hour. Oldfield was one of America's first race car drivers, setting speed records since the turn of the century. (1911) was the year British explorer Robert Scott and the Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen set out on a race to be the first men to reach the South Pole. On December 14th, Amundsen and his party reached the pole first. 25 days later, Scott's team arrived, but they failed to make it home when they tragically perished in a savage blizzard just 11 miles from their base camp. On a more cheerful note, 25-year-old Russian immigrant Irving Berlin published Alexander's Ragtime Band, a song that redefined popular music. Another sound traveled up from the Mississippi Delta by way of musicians Jelly Roll Morton, Blind Lemon Jefferson, and the father of the blues, W.C. Handy, who in 1914 wrote the immortal St. Louis Blues, one of the most recorded songs in the history of music. In April of 1912, the RMS Titanic, the largest man-made object of the day, set sail on its first transatlantic journey from England to New York. Billed as unsinkable and the world's safest ocean liner, the 882.5-foot, 46,000-ton ship cost nearly $7.5 million and boasted every modern convenience except enough lifeboats. The ship hit an iceberg. In the early morning of April 15th, the lifeboat problem became all too apparent. More than 1,500 people went down with the ship, perishing in the frigid 28-degree North Atlantic waters. Meanwhile, the mood in the American political arena also ran cold. After taking office in 1909, President William Howard Taft opposed many of the policy matters of his fellow Republican and former President Teddy Roosevelt. In 1912, Roosevelt challenged Taft for the nomination of the Republican Party.
To you who strive in a spirit of brotherhood for the betterment of our nation, I say we stand above Armageddon and we battle for the Lord.
When Roosevelt lost the Republican nomination, he joined the Progressive Party, founded by Senator Robert La Follette of Wisconsin, and campaigned on the Bull Moose ticket.
The Progressives wanted to effect some kind of social change and have some kind of social responsibility. They wanted to get rid of the tenements. They wanted to get rid of urban overcrowding. They wanted to get rid of the slums. They wanted to make some sort of social fabric knit more closely together for the country, I think.
When November came, neither Taft nor Roosevelt were victorious. Woodrow Wilson was elected the 28th President of the United States. Describing himself as a progressive with the brakes on, Wilson made his debut in presidential politics with a campaign consisting primarily of domestic reform. One issue was women's suffrage. With the role of women taking on an increasingly bigger role outside of the home in business and industry, suffragettes continued their battle to gain equal rights for women.
Women's suffrage really started in the mid-1800s because women, mainly white women, but also free black women who had been active in the abolitionist movement to abolish slavery, discovered, if they didn't already know, that they were in the same spot in many ways. That is, they were chattel, they were possessions. So having been politicized by that, they started to campaign to be able to vote.
Where leaders Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton left off, a new generation of leaders, such as England's Emmeline Pankhurst, picked up.
Emmeline Pankhurst's organisation has had more publicity than anyone else because they simply were involved in theatrical and dramatic and terrorist activity in a way that women had just not done before. They were throwing knives at politicians, they were heckling, which women had never done before, at public meetings. They were slashing famous paintings. They were chaining themselves to railings. In a very famous incident in 1913, one activist threw herself in front of a racehorse at a famous horse competition. All of these kinds of tactics were not what women, the gentle people, had been involved in the 19th century.
Like the British, American suffragettes also campaigned vigorously for voting rights. The most adamant groups picketed government institutions, and some women even went as far as to initiate hunger strikes. In May of 1912, 15,000 women paraded down New York's Fifth Avenue in one of the largest demonstrations of American women in history.
It was very forceful and radical, and only that degree of strength earned a legal identity as human beings for women.
In the world of sports, legendary athlete Jim Thorpe won the decathlon and the pentathlon in the 1912 Summer Olympics. Baseball great Ty Cobb batted over 400 for the second straight year in 1912. His extraordinary 24-year career in the major leagues led him to become the first player inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame in 1936. In 1913, Henry Ford unveiled his assembly line, an ingenious process of building automobiles.
He could mass-produce that car to a scale that the price came way down. And indeed, Henry Ford's, one of his objectives was to make the automobile available to everybody with a few $100s.
As for his employees, Ford doubled his workers' wages and offered profit sharing within the company. Another new economic idea was adopted in 1913 when the U.S. Congress passed the 16th Amendment, implementing a federal income tax. The Panama Canal was finally completed after 10 years of construction. At a cost of nearly $350 million, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers excavated 143 cubic kilometers of earth and battled yellow fever and malaria to join the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans across the Isthmus of Panama. In Mexico, tensions flared again in 1913 when President Madero was murdered. Right-wing Army General Victoriano Huerta seized power, and civil war soon followed. Wilson, concerned over Mexico's political unrest and Germany's continuing interest in Mexico, refused to recognize Huerta and sent troops to the Mexican port of Veracruz to prevent the shipment of German arms. Eventually, Mexican revolutionists drove Huerta from power, and he fled to Germany. Wilson recognized the leadership of Venustiano Carranza and withdrew American troops. 1913 was a pivotal year in the world of art. At the first international exhibition of modern art in New York, the American public was introduced to the European avant-garde. Picasso, Braque, Matisse, and Duchamp, whose painting Nude Descending a Staircase bewildered exhibit-goers and forced critics to reevaluate artistic conventions. By 1913, abstract art had revolutionized painting and sculpture. In Russia, Vasily Kandinsky, a painter from Moscow, garnered attention by blatantly rejecting the use of figurative elements and replacing them with a bedlam of vibrant color and geometric shapes. Kandinsky would prove to be among the most influential painters of his time. In 1913, Parisian concertgoers were outraged while attending the premiere of Russian composer Igor Stravinsky's Rite of Spring. The score received a hailstorm of condemnation, but it would go on to become one of the most celebrated compositions of the 20th century. Meanwhile, a new art form was gaining popularity. By the middle of the decade, 5 million people a day went to see the latest picture show. In 1914, the center of filmmaking moved from New York to a small, dry town in Southern California called Hollywood. D.W. Griffith pioneered the language of film. By 1913, he had directed over 400 one-reel movies, and that same year, he embarked on his greatest film to date, The Birth of a Nation. Premiering in 1915, the 3-hour extravaganza recounting the Civil War set a new cinematic standard and became the first movie shown in the White House.
I used to get under the table and listen to my father and his friends talk about the battles they'd been through and their struggles. Those things impressed you deeply, and I suppose that got into the birth.
President Woodrow Wilson said the impact of Birth of a Nation was like writing history with lightning. Audiences and critics agreed.
It was about something. You can tell easily a story about something. It was about a tremendous struggle. It's about a story of people that were fighting desperately against great odds, great sacrifices, suffering, death.
Although controversial then and now for its racial stereotypes, the movie still packs a punch with its visual skill and creativity. Griffith's camera moves like no other from the silent era, and his close-up shots of actors effectively put the audience closer to the characters on screen. The director was also a master of cross-cutting, keeping the audience on the edge of their seats by editing between different events happening at the same time. Audiences were dazzled, and Birth of a Nation helped establish the movies as a legitimate art form. Max Sennett, a Griffith protege, brought laughs to the silent screen with the first of over 500 Keystone Cop shorts. In 1914, he produced the first feature-length comic film, Tilly's Punctured Romance. The film starred the ever-popular Marie Dressler and a British music hall comedian, Charlie Chaplin. By the end of the decade, Chaplin was commanding $1 million a year, producing and starring in movies based on his brilliant comic creation, The Tramp. Other stars flourished. Douglas Fairbanks thrilled audiences. Theda Bara created one of the screen's first sex symbols. Gladys Smith changed her name to Mary Pickford and became America's sweetheart. Women forged new territory on the social front as well. An unknown nurse named Margaret Sanger addressed the taboo subject of birth control and urged women to challenge the pro-conception idea. For this, she faced an obscenity charge and fled to Europe. 2 years later, she returned and opened the first birth control clinic in Brooklyn. In Europe, tensions simmered and the hope for world peace spiraled downward. After 2 Balkan wars in 1912 and 1913, tension between Serbia and Austria-Hungary grew over the Slavic region of southern Bosnia, which Austria-Hungary had annexed in 1908. Hostility reached the boiling point on June 28, 1914, when the Archduke Francis Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and his wife Sofia were assassinated by a young Serbian while visiting the Bosnian city of Sarajevo.
Archduke Franz Ferdinand wasn't liked especially by the Serbs, because the Serbs were afraid that what he wanted to do was to try and bring the Serbian ethnic groups that lived in the Austrian Empire on a more equal plane. One of the problems that the Austrian Empire always faced was the fact that these ethnic groups within the empire were unhappy with German control, unhappy with Hungarian control. And they were always looking for some kind of autonomy, self-rule, and Franz Ferdinand was sympathetic to that idea. And he was willing to grant to these Serbs a better participation in the government, have more of a political voice in the Austrian Empire. The Serbs in Serbia wouldn't like that. They would not like happy Serbs in the Austrian Empire, because happy Serbs in the Austrian Empire would not want to split and become part of Serbia. And the Serbian nationalists were unhappy, therefore, with this guy. So when he went down to Sarajevo to visit the governor, the Serbs saw the possibility, if we could create a crisis in which the Austrian government would become so unhappy with the Serbian population in their own government, maybe they'd let them go. They'd let them join Serbia. So a certain nationalist group, a terrorist group, decided that they would assassinate the Archduke. When Serbian terrorists killed this Archduke, the Austrians naturally were going to send an ultimatum, which they knew the Serbians would not recognize. They knew the Serbians would reject it. The Austrian government wanted a war with Serbia.
In late July, Austria-Hungary attacked Serbia, and war was declared. Before long, the European military alliances went into effect, and the war broke out on 3 fronts. With the Central Powers of Germany, Turkey, Bulgaria, and Austria-Hungary opposing the Allied forces of Great Britain, France, Russia, Belgium, and eventually Italy, and 3 years later, the United States.
Serbia was allied to Russia. Serbia had depended on Russia when she got her independence back in 1804. And therefore, the Russians and the Serbs had always been sort of closely aligned. They were Slavic, they had the same language, Orthodox religion. There were some natural connections there. So Russia made this alliance with Serbia and said that if you are attacked by anybody, we will come to your defense. So naturally, when Austria declared war against Serbia, it brought Russia into the war. But when Russia came into the war, Germany said, if you are attacked by Russia, we'll come in and support you. And that brought Germany into the war. France came in because they had the alliance with Russia, and they now joined the war against Germany. And then Britain came into the war because Germany violated neutrality of Belgium, which was a neutral country. And the British came into the war, and that's how those sides aligned up for the war itself.
In 1914, when the war began, Germany was pursuing a plan that they've been developing for years called the Schlieffen Plan. This involved a wide flanking movement around the right flank through Belgium, which would then take Paris. Then they would face about to fight the Russians. The logic was that the French were more able to mobilize quickly than the Russians. So they would strike the French first, then face about, and then destroy the Russians. Of course, the French also had a plan. The French plan was Plan 17, and their plan was to advance into Germany through Lorraine. So you really had sort of a pivot. The Germans were coming into France this side, the French were going into Germany on this side.
The German army surged into Belgium in August and continued toward France. Bursting with confidence, Germany boasted they'd have Paris for lunch and Russia for dinner. In August, German troops under the leadership of Generals Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff defeated the Russians at the Battle of Tannenberg. The battle signaled the war's first major victory and propelled Hindenburg and Ludendorff to hero status. The Germans tried to break the Western Line in Belgium, but met strong resistance from French troops in the First Battle of the Marne, also known as the Miracle on the Marne. The Allies drove the Germans back 40 to 50 miles north of the Aisne River. Many felt the war would end sooner than later, and everyone would be home for Christmas. But by the end of 1914, both the Allies and the Central Powers, having suffered losses of 1.5 million, dug into the earth, building a line of trenches.
A line of trenches reaching from Switzerland, across France, through Belgium to the sea, over 400 miles of front, thousands of actual miles of trench line, tunnels and dugouts. The whole war went underground.
No, I was there from June in 1915 until around May in 1917. In fact, I lived in the trenches for 2.5 years in turn. When I first went into the frontline trenches, it wasn't that active. There was a lot of overhead shooting, but it was a trench warfare, and everybody was down underground, so it really wasn't a great hazard or danger to start in on the first. Progressively, as we moved and we started going over the trenches, why that changed the situation then. You're just lucky you didn't get hit.
Trench warfare brought the war to a stalemate. Charging into no man's land to face machine guns, exploding artillery shells, and barbed wire was futile. The military tactic gained little for both sides, but an appalling loss of life.
You get a machine gun that's firing 50 rounds a minute and swinging back and forth on the open, it knocks down, has to knock down a lot of people, even though it's not aimed at it. They say one man in a trench is worth 10 on the ground walking in.
On the dawn of April 15, 1915, a strange green cloud wafted from the German front toward the Allies. It was a lethal gas that settled in the trenches, producing immediate blindness and scarring, destroying lungs and skin. Both sides used mustard gas. Unpredictable weather conditions and troop concentrations made it difficult to control.
Up on this hill there, we come upon an outfit just like mine, only German. They must have just got gas killed.